A rhinoceros stands motionless in the morning mist of the savannah, like a stone statue. Its eyes are nearly useless. This 2-ton giant sees the world as a blur beyond 10 or 15 meters. But right next to its eyelids, right next to its ear, where one misstep from a predator's hoof could be fatal, a tiny bird flits about. It pecks at the skin near the rhinoceros's eye, the most vulnerable spot on its entire body. And the rhinoceros doesn't move, doesn't chase it away, doesn't get angry. Why does a giant who can kill a lion with a single blow of its horn allow a tiny bird to harass its most vulnerable spots? Did you know this bird can eat hundreds of ticks in a single day, literally stripping the rhinoceros's skin of parasites? In this episode, you'll learn what this mysterious bird is, why rhinos, with their poor eyesight, have turned it into a living security system, and why scientists are still debating whether this is a genuine helper or a cunning manipulator simply disguised as a friend. Like and subscribe to the channel. Enjoy. The bird is called the oxpecker, or bufaga, a red-billed species, one of 2 species of this genus found in Africa. It's small, slightly larger than a sparrow, with a sturdy body, sharp claws, and a beak that's quite unlike that of a common songbird. It's compressed laterally, like a pair of small scissors, the perfect tool for gently plucking ticks from fur and folds of skin without injuring the host. The oxpecker spends almost its entire life on the bodies of large African herbivores: rhinos, buffalo, giraffes, zebras, antelopes. For this bird, any large animal becomes a mobile home, a dining area, and a lookout point, all rolled into one. But the relationship with the rhinoceros is special. It stems from the rhinoceros's anatomy. It has thick, folded skin, covered in numerous hiding places, behind the ears, in the folds near the neck, in the groin, where ticks feel like they're in a hotel. And the rhinoceros's vision is designed in such a way that it's unable to detect small threats right next to its own body. This is where true cooperation begins. The oxpecker's claws are designed differently than those of most birds. They are prehensile and curved, allowing the bird to cling to vertical or inclined surfaces as securely as a woodpecker clings to a tree trunk. The oxpecker's tail is stiff and springy. It provides additional support when the bird climbs the rhinoceros's side, hangs upside down from its neck, or balances on the very top of its head. All of this was designed by nature not simply for aesthetics, but to enable it to hunt directly on a living table, which constantly moves, shakes itself, and sometimes tilts its head sharply. Scientists observing oxpeckers in the wild have documented that in a single attack, the bird can remove dozens or even hundreds of ticks from a single animal's body. Moreover, the oxpecker doesn't choose just any body part at random. It clearly prefers the ears, neck, eye area, and open wounds, as these are where the most parasites accumulate and where the skin is thinner, making it easier to reach the food. This is why the bird can often be seen just a centimeter from a rhinoceros's eyeball, a place where, one would think, any large animal would be nervous and ward off any intruder. But the rhinoceros endures. And it's not just a matter of tolerance. There's a theory, supported by research observations, that the oxpeckers serve another important function. They act as a kind of alarm. When danger approaches, be it a human, a lion, or simply a loud noise, the birds take flight with a characteristic, sharp, raspy cry. For the rhinoceros, with its mediocre eyesight and imperfect hearing, such a signal can be decisive, a split-second head start that separates a timely escape from a deadly encounter with a predator or hunter. It turns out that we're dealing with more than just a skin cleaner, but a fully fledged biological partner, integrated into the rhinoceros's survival system. In the morning, before the fog clears over the savannah, a troop of oxpeckers settles on the rhinoceros's back and head like the crew of a huge ship. They begin a methodical patrol, behind the ear, along the folds of the neck, at the base of the horn, around the eyes. Every tick removed from the skin means a little less itching, a little less inflammation, a little less chance of infection for the giant, who can't scratch himself in the right place with his short legs. But it would be too simple to say this is a perfect friendship. Nature is rarely so straightforward. Because behind this image of a morning spa service lies a far more complex and not always pleasant truth about what really happens between a bird and a rhinoceros when open wounds and drops of blood are involved. What if the savannah medic isn't quite the selfless helper it first appears? Morning gives way to midday. The sun rises, and real work is already underway on the rhinoceros's back. The oxpeckers move from one patch of skin to another, and finally, one stops at an old scratch on the rhinoceros's side, where the skin has already begun to heal after a recent encounter with a thorny bush or a rival. And then something happens that has long been left out of the beautiful story of savannah orderlies. The bird doesn't simply inspect the wound. It begins to peck at it. This isn't a coincidence or the fault of an individual. Scientists who have studied the behavior of oxpeckers for decades have documented a consistent pattern. If there aren't enough ticks on their host, the birds switch to blood and tissue from open wounds, and sometimes even keep the wound open so they can return to it again and again. Researcher Rowan Plotz, who studied these birds in South Africa, directly calls this behavior parasitic. Feeding on blood and damaged tissue actually harms the host, not helps it. It's worth remembering what parasitism is in its simplest sense: when one organism benefits at the expense of another while harming it. And for a long time, the oxpecker was considered a model example of the opposite phenomenon: mutualism, where both parties benefit. A bird eats ticks, a rhinoceros gets rid of parasites. A classic story from school biology textbooks. But the more closely researchers observed the bird's actual behavior, the more this beautiful picture began to crumble at the seams. It turns out that many of the ticks eaten by oxpeckers have already fed on their host's blood before they're removed. This means the bird gets a nutritious meal, but the rhinoceros gets little practical relief. The damage from the tick has already been done. Moreover, several scientific studies failed to find a statistically significant correlation between the presence of oxpeckers on the animal's body and a decrease in the overall tick count. In other words, whether birds are present or not, the host's parasite load, on average, doesn't change as much as one might hope in a perfect friendship. Is there any data on how often birds actually peck at wounds, rather than simply choosing the most vulnerable feeding option? One study, conducted on captive black rhinoceroses, found that out of 855 recorded instances of oxpeckers feeding on the animals' bodies, only 6 episodes involved feeding directly on an open wound. This is a relatively small proportion of the total number of observations. It appears that wound pecking is not the oxpecker's primary feeding method, but rather a situational strategy the bird resorts to when safer prey, ticks and insects, is in short supply. But even rare episodes of feeding on wounds can cause significant harm to their owner. Scientists note that such behavior can prolong the healing time of injuries and create an additional risk of infection, as an open wound that a bird constantly returns to heals much more slowly than one left alone. For a wild animal living outdoors, among dust, insects, and the hot sun, this is no small matter. Any unhealed scratch can become a serious problem. This presents a strange picture. On the one hand, the oxpecker should reduce the tick load on the rhinoceros's body, as ticks are carriers of dangerous diseases and a source of constant itching and skin irritation. On the other hand, scientific observations do not confirm that the presence of birds actually reduces the number of parasites in the host over the long term. And sometimes, the birds even cause direct harm, maintaining open wounds for their own nutrition. So, is this a helper who simply turned out to be less effective than previously thought? Or a skilled manipulator who has evolved to appear useful while remaining a consumer of others' resources? It's important to emphasize here, science hasn't yet settled this issue definitively. Various studies conducted in different settings, in the wild and in captivity, on different host species, and in different regions of Africa, sometimes yield conflicting results. Some scientists are inclined to believe the balance of power is tipped toward parasitism. Others insist that when looking at the whole picture, including not only diet but also other aspects of oxpecker behavior, the benefits to the rhinoceros remain significant. Another theory is that the balance of benefits and harms can vary significantly depending on the specific situation, the season, tick availability, the skin condition of the individual animal, and even the age of the rhinoceros itself. And here arises a question that has haunted researchers for many years. If natural selection usually eliminates unfavorable relationships, why don't rhinos, large, strong animals armed with impressive horns, simply chase away these birds? Why haven't millions of years of coevolution led to the breakdown of this precarious alliance, if it sometimes causes real harm to the rhinoceros? The answer to this question turned out to be far more interesting than expected, and it has nothing to do with ticks or wounds, but with a peculiarity of the rhinoceros's vision that makes the cry of this small bird a matter of life and death. Midday gives way to evening. The sun sinks toward the horizon, and the savanna is bathed in golden light. The rhinoceros continues to leisurely stroll along the riverbed, while a flock of oxpeckers continues their work on its back. And then, a sharp, raspy cry. The birds take flight almost simultaneously, as if an invisible alarm had been triggered. The rhinoceros shudders, turns, and begins sniffing the air. In the next second, it will become clear whether it responded correctly to this signal. But the fact that it responded to it turned out to be far more important than any pecks. It was here that science found an answer that had long eluded researchers. A real, measurable benefit that oxpeckers provide to rhinoceroses. In 2018, researcher Rowan Plotz and colleague Wayne Linklater published a study in the journal Current Biology, in which they monitored black rhinoceroses in South Africa for over a year. The scientists tagged the animals and then attempted to approach them as closely and undetected as possible, much like a poacher or hunter. The result was almost sensational. Rhinoceroses with oxpeckers on their bodies detected human approach significantly more often than rhinoceroses without bird companions. According to various estimates, the presence of oxpeckers allowed the animals to avoid human approach undetected in almost half the cases. For a species that has suffered for decades from poaching for its horns, such a difference can literally mean life or death. A rhinoceros, with poor eyesight and less than sharp hearing, is physically incapable of spotting a human stalking a few dozen meters away. But the oxpecker perched on its back has the keen eyesight of a bird and instantly reacts to any movement in the grass. The alarm cry that the flock emits at the slightest sign of danger has become something of an early warning system for the rhinoceros. The very reason the Swahili name for these birds translates as rhinoceros guardian. This is why natural selection hasn't broken this bond, despite rare episodes of feeding on open wounds. The cost of a few unhealed scratches is significantly lower than the cost of a single missed encounter with a predator or a person with a gun. Nature isn't choosing between perfect friendship and pure parasitism. It chooses what ultimately offers the greatest chance of survival. And for the rhinoceros, this combination clearly adds up to a win, even if individual interactions with birds aren't exactly pleasant. There's another layer to this story that's rarely mentioned when discussing oxpeckers. These birds don't just feed on the bodies of large mammals, they build their entire lives around them, including reproduction. Oxpeckers nest in groups. typically one breeding pair and several helpers who share in caring for the chicks. To insulate and line their nests, they use the wool of the very animals they feed on, including rhinoceroses, buffalo, and other ungulates. It turns out that for the oxpecker, a rhinoceros isn't just a mobile dining room, but also a source of building material for its future home. It's also worth mentioning how voracious these birds are. According to some reports, the oxpecker can consume hundreds of adult ticks and up to several thousand tick larvae in a single day. Even if the overall effect on the tick population in a given host isn't always statistically significant, the sheer scale of this feeding behavior is impressive. Imagine a small bird whose diet consists almost entirely of parasites, earwax, dead skin, and, occasionally, the blood of large mammals. There's a sad side to this story, one directly linked to the fate of the rhinos themselves. Populations of black and white rhinos in Africa have plummeted due to poaching for their horns. And with the decline in their large hosts comes a dwindling number of habitats where oxpeckers can feed and survive. These birds are so closely linked ecologically to large herbivores that the fate of one species directly impacts the other. Scientists are seriously considering restoring oxpecker populations as part of their overall conservation efforts for large African mammals. After all, reintroducing the birds to areas where rhinos and buffalo are almost extinct is simply impossible. So what is the rhinoceros's oxpecker really like? A caring companion, or a sophisticated manipulator who has learned to appear useful? The correct answer, it seems, eludes simple formulation. This is not a story of pure friendship, where one helps the other simply out of kindness. And it is not a story of pure parasitism, where one only harms the other. It is a far more honest and far more realistic picture of how nature really works. Two very different creatures, linked by millions of years of co-evolution, have found a precarious, imperfect, but working balance. It brings the rhinoceros splinters in the form of pecked wounds, and simultaneously saves it from a far more dire threat posed by humans and predators. It provides the bird with food and a home, and makes its life completely dependent on the well-being of the giant on whose back it spends almost all its time. The dawn with which our story began is repeated every day in the savannah. The rhinoceros wakes, and the oxpecker pack is already ready for work. Not because it's a noble mission, but because this is how their life together is structured, honed by evolution to a delicate balance of benefit and cost. And perhaps this is the main lesson of the story of the oxpecker and the rhinoceros. Nature rarely provides simple answers to the question of who is the hero and who is the villain. More often than not, both definitions are incomplete, and the truth lies somewhere in the constant, living balance between them. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to the channel, like it, and be sure to let us know in the comments. What do you think of a rhinoceros's oxpecker? A true friend, or a calculating companion who simply learned to look helpful? Share your thoughts. We're genuinely interested in your thoughts.